All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to this conversation with Benjamin Wittes. My name is Alan Rosenstein. I am a professor here at the law school. Before I introduce Ben, I want to first thank everyone at the law school who made this possible. I'd like to thank the Federal Society and the American Constitution Society for co-sponsoring this event. And I'd particularly like to thank Krista Deskowitz and Deanna Mello for a huge amount of work that they put into this event. So thank you very much to everyone. I'd also like to discuss the format just briefly. I'm going to start by asking Ben a few questions about the overall theme of today's conversation to kick things off. But I'm most eager, and I know Ben is, to get all of your questions. To that end, hopefully everyone received an index card when they walked in. I'd ask that as you have questions, you write them down. There are 3 volunteers here. If you could raise your hands, please. Thank you. Here in the left, center, and right, who will collect them from the aisles. So just pass your index card down to the aisle, and they'll collect them, and then they'll bring them up, and I'll ask them. The reason we're doing it this format is so we can have some thematic unity in our discussion, and also we're recording this event, and so it makes for much easier recording when it's just 2 people talking into microphones. So let me introduce Ben. Ben Wittes is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. He is the editor-in-chief and co-founder of the online magazine Lawfare, which has become essential reading over the past several years and a source that I encourage everyone that's interested in American constitutional politics and American constitutional law to follow closely, especially in the months to come. Ben is also a legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He's the author of many books, including a 2002 assessment of Ken Starr, the independent counsel in the impeachment of President Bill Clinton. He has a forthcoming book co-authored with Susan Hennessy entitled Unmaking the Presidency, Donald Trump's War on the World's Most Powerful Office. It'll be out in January of 2020, and I highly recommend you pre-order it. I have already. It is essential reading. So Ben, let's get started. The title of this talk is Donald Trump and the Powers of the Presidency. And so the first question I want to ask is just how different is President Trump in his exercise of his presidential powers than have his predecessors been, and how much of his behavior is actually a continuation of themes we've seen over several decades?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, look, there are certain similarities between Trump and his predecessors. They have roughly the same number of arms and legs. Most presidents have had 2 eyes. And there the resemblance largely stops. Jokes aside, I think actually the candid answer to your question is that the differences are dramatic and they cross a pretty wide range of presidential conduct. Trump he feels like he's acting differently because across a broad range of areas he actually is acting differently. He sounds very different from other presidents because in fact he uses rhetoric in a fashion that's deeply different from not some, but all of his predecessors. The management of the executive branch feels chaotic because in fact he's running it differently from the way essentially all of his predecessors have run it. And I think when you line up all of the areas in which his behavior is not just different, but radically different and pervasively different, you have to take that pretty seriously as a sort of departure from the historic presidency, and a pretty deliberative one. And then there is one other element that I think is important in this regard, which is that they say that hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. Trump actually doesn't pay any homage to virtue if we assume that the traditional way that the presidency has behaved is virtuous in some sense. He actually publicly defends his deviations from what we have come to expect of the presidency. And that means, if I break into your house and steal your stuff and I stick it in a warehouse and cover up the fact that I did it, that's an enforcement problem, right? There are laws against theft in the state of Minnesota. There are laws against breaking and entering. There are probably laws against possession of stolen merchandise or activity, right? So that's all of them. I'm not challenging any of those laws. I'm simply defying them. But if I do all those things and then go on television and say, I've broken into your house and taken your stuff because there's no such thing as property rights, and by the way, the community at large owns your house, and I'm part of the community, and I've expropriated this stuff, and I'm returning it to the people, that is sort of less an issue of theft than it is a fundamental challenge to the idea of property rights. And so when you articulate a public defense of the things that you've done, that becomes a challenge to the nature of the order. And I think the most profound thing that Trump does is not merely to do the things that he's done, but to insist in a very public and energetic way that this is the way presidents should behave. And that becomes a very deep challenge to the sort of established expectations of the presidency itself.
So I can't help but talk about a Time story that broke, I don't know if it was 10 minutes ago or an hour ago, but it broke today. So I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs because it's really quite remarkable.
But before you do, can I just say that the fact that not merely that you can do this, but that on any given day, like a conversation like this would be interrupted by some news break in which itself was thematically related to it, and you would be able to do this, is itself a telling. And I don't know what you're going to read, but if we'd had this conversation yesterday, that would have happened. The day before, that would have happened, and that is itself a telling comment on the situation.
Yeah, I wish that I and my former deep state colleagues could take credit for this, but it's really just very coincidental. This is from the New York Times from today. President Trump, already facing impeachment for pressuring Ukraine to investigate his political rivals, publicly called on China on Thursday, today, to examine former Vice President Joseph Biden as well, an extraordinary request to a foreign power for help that could benefit him in next year's election. China should start an investigation into the Bidens because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine, Mr. Trump told reporters as he left the White House to travel to Florida. His request came just moments after he discussed upcoming trade talks with China and said that if they do not do what we want, we have tremendous power. Honestly, I wish I were reading from Wait, Don't Tell Me transcript, but this is from the front page of the New York Times. And there's a lot to unpack here, but to me, what's most striking is Trump's willingness to be so blunt in saying the sorts of things that wouldn't just be, I think, controversial if said by another president, but would be quite literally unthinkable. And in a way, there's a certain way in which the transparency of the way President Trump operates is almost admirable. And my question is, how does a political system or a constitutional system respond effectively when the president is so willing to flout norms that have gone unchallenged for decades?
All right, so there's a lot in this question, and I want to tease out three distinct elements of this question and treat them separately. The first is your phrase, quite literally unthinkable. And one of the deepest challenges that Trump presents to the historical presidency and to our kind of expectations of the presidency is that he has made the unthinkable thinkable on a regular basis. And that is, by the way, not always a terrible thing. So Woodrow Wilson once rewrote the presidency by writing a bunch of books saying that, this was in his capacity as the president of Princeton University, back when we used to elect college presidents to be governors and then presidents. And he wrote a set of books that said American government should be different. We should be having sort of more party-oriented, British-inflected government. He wrote a pair of books about it, and then he kind of takes over the Democratic Party, runs for president, and having made sort of the unthinkable of sort of more party government in the United States thinkable, he proceeds to implement it. And by the way, we're all living in the residue of that for the subsequent 130 years. Trump is a little bit less of a theoretician than Woodrow Wilson was. But one of the most important things that he does is because his ideation is so unfiltered between the way when he thinks something and when he articulates something, that if he has the idea that, gosh, the Chinese should be investigating Joe Biden, he'll just say it, right? And because, this is at the risk of dabbling in clinical matters that I have no business dabbling, but because he's a bit obsessive, and there's actually no difference between his private speech and his public speech. There is when he says stuff in public, it is also the things that he's saying in private to other governments, to congressional leaders, right? And so a really good way of understanding what his private conversation is like, his conversations with law enforcement, which is a different issue, they're all the same. And so one of the things that he's done, as your question describes, is taken a list of things that were unthinkable for a president to do and put them all on the table. And because he does it, this gets me to the second part of your question, which is I'm not sure I've ever seen somebody who lies more frequently with less hypocrisy than Trump does, right? So he lies constantly. But there are a few things about which he is always almost entirely honest. And one of them is his own emotional state, of which he has no ability to disguise at all. And he's quite transparent about. And so when he is, doing this utterly without hypocrisy, strips away the element of denial and obfuscation that often serves to protect norms. So when Richard Nixon violated all sorts of norms and laws, lying about it, covering it up, which was, of course, one of the bases for his ultimate impeachment, abortive impeachment, but his removal as president, actually had the perverse effect of preserving the integrity of the norms. Because he denied the things he was doing, he honored the basic idea that they were wrong to do. So Trump doesn't do that. And that actually presents a very, very deep challenge, which brings me to the actual text of your question. When the president stands up and says, Ukraine should investigate my political opponent, China should be investigating my political opponent, that is a challenge to the political system, because quite apart from the wrongness of the action, the defense of the action, when Trump says that his conversation with Ukraine was perfect, it was beautiful, a beautiful conversation, there's nothing anybody should object to about his conversation with Zelensky, that is a challenge. Are we prepared to accept? He is asserting the propriety of presidents behaving that way. And that is a challenge independent of the action itself.
So let me ask, if we follow up on this discussion of norms, and it's something I know you've written about, and it's something that ever since the president was elected, we've all started talking about a lot more. One of the tricky things about norms is that by definition, they're not written down, and by definition, they're not enforceable. And so how are we supposed to know what norms exist? And how are we supposed to catalog them? And
I decide.
You decide, yes. You alone.
Right.
You
I
alone.
alone decide the norms.
And how do we make sure, and is a system that relies so much on unwritten norms, is it strong enough to withstand the attack of someone like President Trump, who, as you put it, is quite happy to flout these norms and call them into question?
So first of all, I do disagree with the premise of the question, which is that norms are inherently unenforceable. Norms are enforced by means other than strict law, than formal law, but that doesn't mean they are not enforced. Look, all systems depend on norms. I mean, all systems that involve the investment of discretion in somebody have expectations of the exercise of that discretion that are normative, not legal. And there is no way to get around that, right? You have an officer who is given certain authorities. Those authorities can be vast or they can be narrow, but you cannot write a code that is detailed enough to detail how all questions should be resolved. And the result is that, to some degree, the responsible officer is vested with the ability to make decisions, and what guides that ability to make decisions fundamentally is the expectations of what the political system will expect. The means will accept, sorry, not expect. The means of enforcing those norms are the political system accepting or not accepting the exercises of those discretionary judgments. And so the question is, what do you have to do if you're Donald Trump before the political system doesn't accept the exercise of discretion anymore? And I think we may be at the point where we are finding out the answer to that question. So let's tick through what the system does accept. It does accept tweeting things that we all would have acknowledged as grossly inappropriate for the president to tweet over a long period of time, dozens of times a week, sometimes dozens of times a day. That it accepts, right? And I think that, so the norm against presidential, sort of logorrheal impropriety is gone. Now, whether we at some point reestablish it is an interesting question, but for now, we know that the political system, and by the way, the specific things that the political system will tolerate the president saying are pretty extraordinary. So it certainly includes per se libelous statements about career government officials, right? The president has accused Pete Strzok of treason. Treason is a crime defined by the Constitution. Whatever one thinks about Pete Strzok's texts with Lisa Page and activities in the FBI, he is not guilty of treason, right? So that in any other context would be a per se libel. The system is accepting of that. The system is accepting of the firing of senior law enforcement officials for overtly political reasons, because they insist on investigating certain things that are inconvenient to the president and refuse to investigate other things that would be convenient to the president, like, for example, Hillary Clinton's emails. The system is tolerant of the sort of arbitrary and unjustified, and that's a normative statement, but I'll stand by it, invocation of the national emergencies, of a national emergency for purposes of using unappropriated congressional funds for a favored construction project. I could go on, but the system will tolerate a great deal, all of which is done in public in an unhypocritical fashion. It seems to be drawing a different line at this call with the president of Ukraine in the specific circumstances that it happened. I am pleased to see it drawing a line. I am a little bit perplexed as to why the line is here rather than here, rather than here, rather than here.
So one thing that you've written about a lot is the impact of Donald Trump's personality, personal characteristics, his inner self, to the extent that he has one that's separate from his outer self, and the effect of that on his ability to carry out his constitutional duties. And there's a very interesting argument you've made over the past several years about Donald Trump's constitutional ability or inability, as the case may be, to fulfill his responsibilities under the Take Care Clause, and to fulfill his responsibilities to defend the Constitution, as is his oath of office. And I was hoping you could share a little bit about that.
Well, all right. So a couple thoughts on that. So first of all, being a president is in some ways, this is going to sound weird, but bear with me for a second. In some ways, it's a little bit like being a law student. So when you apply to law school, right, you actually want to be just like everybody else, only a little bit better, right? You take the same test as everybody else took, and you're going to do better if you have a slightly higher score on that test, right? You have gone to some undergraduate institution and you all have transcripts, and some of your transcripts reflect a slightly higher GPA than others, and so there's a kind of and then you show up at law school and there's a series of assignments, right? And you're not going to say, I'm not going to do this assignment, I'm going to do a completely different one that I assign. You're going to do the same assignments that everybody else does, only you're going to do them a little bit better, right? That's the objective. And so there's a sense in which what you're trying to do is conform to a certain set of forms, only do them in a fashion that is A, recognizably within the form, and B, a high quality performance within that form. So presidents are not actually all that different from that, right? We all have this sense, just as we have a sense of what it means to be a law student, we have a sense of what it means to be a president. Some of that sense is laid out in the Constitution with a specific list of obligations, authorities, and activities. And a lot of it is just developed by our historic sense of what the presidency is. Presidents do this because that's what presidents do, right? So the Constitution says that the president shall, from time to time, give Congress information about the state of the union. And from this, at some point, also related to Woodrow Wilson, by the way, that came to mean going up to a joint session of Congress, giving a formal address, being applauded warmly by people who hate you when you walk in the room, being interrupted by applause, right? That's what that came to mean. And so presidents do that because that's what they expect that presidents do. And there's a series of forms that everybody tries to follow because they are conditioned by this set of expectations. Well, now you take somebody who is characterologically, for whatever reason, and I'm not a clinical psychologist, but utterly unmoored to that set of expectations. And he doesn't actually want to follow the form at all. So it's as though somebody shows up at law school and announces that sort of instead of going to 1L classes, I'm going to do clowning, right? It's actually just mapping, but it's insistent that this is an actual expression of the presidency, that this is the way the presidency should behave. And so then you have to ask this question, well, is juggling, face painting, costuming, is all of this law school, right? And the answer in the case of law school would, of course, be no, because there's an authoritative decision maker as to that, which is the law school administration kind of gets to say, love your act. It kind of doesn't have anything to do with law school. But with the presidency, that's not really the way it works, because there's only two authoritative decision makers. There's the question of what Congress will tolerate, subject to its ultimate impeachment authority. And there's the question of what you can convince voters representing 271 electoral votes is okay. And so I think that this, at the sort of deepest level, the challenge is, are we willing to reimagine the presidency the way he is imagining it? And by the way, though he is not a theoretician, he is doing this deliberately, and he will tell you that. And one of the most striking of his the place where he's most candid about this, by the way, is his rallies. And there was a rally that he had for I forget his name, Saccone, the guy who was running against Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania. And Trump shows up at the rally, and he says, he's talking, and he talks for a long time. And then he says, they say I'm not presidential. But it's really easy to be presidential. Here, I'll be presidential for you. And then he walks away from the podium, he turns around and he walks back and he stands up. He's really stiff and he goes, "My fellow Americans, thank you for being here. Rick Saccone will be an excellent congressman and he will help me very much and you should all vote for him. And for those of you who are," and he goes on like this for a while, sort of faking being presidential, and then he turns around and he toddles away. And then he comes back in his own persona and says, "See, I can do that. But if I did that and showed up like a stiff, you guys would be so bored. And what I'm doing is much harder than that." And so I think it is actually a mistake, and it sells him short to imagine that he is doing this completely impulsively and without any thought. I think it's actually quite deliberate, and I think he's pretty clear about that.
So I have a couple more questions for you, but I do want to start getting audience questions. So why doesn't everybody who's filled out an index card so far pass it to one of the aisles, and one of our volunteers will collect them and pass them up. And if you have a question you'd like to ask, please do write it down, and we'll do another round of this in a few minutes. So one thing that's hard to, let's say, criticize Donald Trump for is surprise at this. And there is a saying that every country gets the government it ultimately deserves. And there certainly was quite a bit of evidence during the campaign and before Trump was elected that this was how he was going to act. And yet there seems to have been some disbelief, not just among Republican leaders, but also I think among a broad swath of the Republican electorate, that this was the president that we were actually going to get.
There was going to be the pivot.
It was going to be the pivot. So, I mean, was this really unknowable? I mean, it seems now quite foolish to have thought that there was going to be this pivot to presidentialism. Do you think that was an unfair or that was an unreasonable thing to think at the time?
So, I mean, when it became clear that Trump was going to be elected, was going to be nominated as the Republican nominee, I wrote a series of articles on lawfare, which unfortunately have aged very well. And they have the same name as this talk, which was Trump and the Powers of the American Presidency. And it was in 3 parts. And it kind of laid it all out. And so at one level, I say it was knowable, and I say that with the confidence of somebody who actually, tried to imagine the interactions of this particular personality with this particular office and came up with something not wholly dissimilar from what we've got. On the other hand, I do want to say that I think aspects of the pivot thesis were reasonable. Partly because by the time they started showing up, we were dealing with a situation I think somebody who, in the context of the campaign, says, "I don't care what he's saying, I think he'll calm down and be fine," I think that would be a very foolish thing to have said, and I argued very strongly against it. On the other hand, somebody who during the transition said, look, this was a dangerous situation, it's a reckless vote. That said, he's the duly elected president-elect of the United States, and all presidents need good advice, and all administrations need sobriety, and this one's going to need more of it than some others. And so therefore, let's act like there will be a pivot and encourage it and behave that way and treat it as a rebuttable thesis. I don't really have a problem with that, with the proviso that I do think it was naive and improbable, and at this point it has been shown to be a thesis that, or a hypothesis that can't be sustained.
So we've talked at a pretty high level about Trump, and I think it'd be useful to go into some of the specific areas in which he has departed quite dramatically from his predecessors. And one area that comes to mind is how he runs the executive branch, or fails to run the executive branch. One of the things that's, I think, really notable about the Trump administration is just how leaky the White House is, just how leak-prone the administration is, just how little control Donald Trump seems to actually have over his administration. And is that something new? Is that something he has caused? Is that a reaction to him? Why does he seem to be so incapable of effectuating the idea of the unitary executive?
Yeah, so this is one of the sort of, I would say, enduring mysteries of the Trump administration, except in many ways it's not mysterious at all. It's a creature of his personality. It's a creature of his ambitions. So when he issued the original travel ban order, I wrote a piece about it, the headline of which was "Malevolence Tempered by Incompetence." And I did not know when I wrote that it was going to kind of become a sort of catch-all description of the sort of entire way the administration behaved, or at least the way the White House behaved. But it's become a kind of catchphrase that used to describe the sort of management style holding back the policy objectives of the administration. So a few things on this. The first is that one of the things that Trump is most insistent about is that he cares only about the expressive dimensions of the presidency. He doesn't care about, fundamentally, the executive power is a management job, right? I mean, the president actually is supposed to run this immense set of interlocking bureaucracies. And he runs those bureaucracies by appointing people to administer them, and by giving direction, and by resolving disputes between them. The presidency is an extraordinarily difficult management job. And George W. Bush, in one of his more delicious turns of phrase, I think there's actually an immense amount of wisdom in this, described his own job in his administration as, "I'm the decider." And Bush was mocked for this, because Bush was mocked for everything. But there's actually, and I think he was mocked for it because he said decider instead of decision maker, I think. But I think it was actually intentional, and I think it actually captured something deep and important, which is the fundamental job of the president is to make decisions. And the fundamental job of the executive branch is to, A, execute those decisions, and B, to tee up information for the president to make decisions well, right? And Trump is much more interested in the theatrical dimensions of the presidency than he is in the actual management functions of the executive branch. This is something that other presidents have sometimes tolerated, sometimes reveled in, sometimes been good at, sometimes not been good at. But I don't think there are very many presidents, if any, who have so completely sublimated the management functions of the presidency and the executive branch to the sort of expressive dimensions of it. The sort of, people call it the sort of reality show elements of it. But I think that may, I think of it almost more as vanity plate elements, right? And one of the things about sublimating the core functions of an office to some other function is that you won't tend to do it well. And so it's not surprising that he's just actually not good at managing the executive branch. He doesn't like it. And what he really likes is just announcing things. So what happens if you just announce things that happen to be contrary to the policies of your, for example, Defense Department with lots of deployed people in Syria, and all of a sudden you announce that you're withdrawing forces from Syria? Well, you might get contradicted by some lower official, right? What happens if you announce that your wires at Trump Tower were tapped, and you do it in a tweet because you just saw some speculation about it on Fox News? Well, somebody might file a FOIA request asking for records from the Justice Department about this. And the Justice Department might respond that there are no records responsive to your request, right? And
do you say this from personal experience?
No, that was not my FOIA.
That was not your
request.
FOIA?
I wish it were. It was a smart FOIA request. And the FBI director may be asked in congressional testimony, what can you tell us about the wiretaps of Trump Tower? And he may have to say, and he may even take a certain glee in saying, as to the president's tweets, we have no information that substantiates them. You may have a UN ambassador who runs her own foreign policy. And when you say, Nikki Haley was confused, she says, with all due respect, I don't get confused, right? And you may have a Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who when asked about Charlottesville and the president's statements, says the president speaks for himself, which, by the way, would get anybody fired in any prior administration, to contradict, to dismiss a presidential statement like that. These are inevitable consequences of not actually managing the executive branch, but of just kind of saying whatever you want to say whenever you want to say it, while there are ongoing policy processes that may cut in very different directions. And that finally brings me to the issue of leaks. In a unitary executive, even a disunitary, non-functioning unitary executive, where lots and lots of civil servants and uniformed military and intelligence officers of one sort or another have a kind of vertically integrated hierarchy that they're supposed to be observing. If you create a situation in which none of them have any confidence in the ability of that vertically integrated policy process to get to anything like the right answer, they will start to take matters into their own hands. Some of them will file whistleblower complaints. And while we've been sitting here, the New York Times has reported that there's apparently an IRS whistleblower complaint that is, becoming public, or the reality of which, the fact of which is becoming public. Some of them will file whistleblower complaints. Some others will not be quite as quick as they would have been a few weeks earlier to talk to a reporter that they might know from a different walk of life. And you have seen that happen in a huge way. And I think I am not a big proponent of leaks, and I don't mean to endorse it. I do think that the preponderant leaking is an inevitable consequence of the style of management, combined with the amount of lying that goes on.
So let's talk about the effect on actual policy for a second, because we spend a lot of time talking about.
I don't think about policy.
You don't think about policy, yeah. You used to think about hard national security choices.
And now I think about dumb national security choices.
Yes, like whether we should bayonet people trying to cross the border, or yeah.
I really like the idea of a snake, of a moat with snakes.
Alligators, right?
Was it alligators?
Yeah, I think it's alligators. So this is a question from the audience that I think is nicely teased this up. Courts frequently defer to executive branch agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. The EPA's political leadership under Trump is dishonest and scornful of legitimate science. Does EPA deserve deference from the courts should it be challenged? And obviously there's an EPA-specific question here, but I think there's a more general question of when you have a breakdown in process, when you have a breakdown in the orderly, deliberative process by which policy flows up from the bureaucracy to the president and flows down from the president to the bureaucracy, how much does that unsettle this whole edifice of law that we have developed that really gives enormous discretion to the president?
All right, so I want to distinguish between two very distinct forms of failures of deference or declination as to deference. So one is somebody gets elected with a policy agenda that may be disrespectful of scientific data. And so this is the premise of this question, right? This has very little to do with the personality of Donald Trump or Trump's personal exercise of the powers of the presidency. It rather has to do with the fact that, and I am not an environmental science person at all, but let us take as a given that some of the that a lot of scientists do not believe that the policy initiatives and deregulatory initiatives that the administration is pushing are necessarily supported by the best available science. It's fair to say that that is, first of all, not remotely a new problem. Many administrations have areas in which their preferred policy outcomes are not supported by the best available science. Some have more of them than others, and it may well be the case that at a purely policy level, particularly in the climate arena, this one has some big problems in that area. But that is actually, there are very few administrations that are, science before everything, will really follow it wherever it leads without regard to how it interacts with political constituencies. And so I think that problem is actually not new to the Trump administration. It may be fierce in the current administration, but it's an old problem that I think administrative law is reasonably well positioned to think about. The problem that I think is genuinely novel in the Trump administration involves national security deference. And you see this in the travel ban cases. You see it in some of the other cases as well. There are these framework statutes that give the president personally immense deference with respect to national security judgments. For example, the statute on which the travel ban was based basically says whenever the president decides that it's necessary to bar a whole large group of people from a particular place to the United States, he can issue an order doing that, right? Now, the assumption behind this is that the president is only going to use this when there's an actual national security reason to do it. A national security reason to do it. The national emergency declaration statutes are very similar. They're big and broad. The sanction statutes are very similar. They're big and broad. IEPA gives the president a lot of power to impose sanctions for national security reasons. And actually, the trade tariffs rules give pretty wide, and all of these are discretionary statutes with sort of sweeping invocations of presidential discretion. Here's the problem. They all assume And this gets a little bit to the question you were asking earlier about what it means for somebody like this to swear the oath of office. They're all assuming that the president is earnestly trying to protect the national security. And we may disagree about what that requires in a particular circumstances, but hey, we elected this guy to make those judgments, so we, as a non-national security branch, defer to the guy who was the one guy who's elected by the entire population with national security responsibilities. We're going to defer to him. That's the premise, and there's a huge edifice of judicial interpretation based on the idea of deferring to that person. Now, this is a different problem than we don't trust the Commerce Department on census stuff, or we don't trust, what if we don't trust, and 5 justices of the Supreme Court, 6 justices of the Supreme Court, 9 justices of the Supreme Court know in their hearts that he is not making these decisions on actual national security grounds. Rather, he is framing non-national security equities as national security equities in order to get this deference. Number one, first of all, that is exactly what's happening, and everybody knows it. And number two, our doctrine has no way of thinking about that invocation, sort of bad faith invocation of pretext. And it is very underdeveloped in that regard. And it's very hard to imagine how you would adapt it to deal with this situation without destroying the edifice of national security deference itself. I think that is actually a really, really hard problem. And Trump may force the Supreme Court, in the travel ban case, the Supreme Court goes a little bit of the way there, but ultimately defers. Question is how many times this is a multi-iterative game, how long before they say, this is too much. We're not going there anymore. And that is a question that is very particular to Trump in contrast to the sort of normal administrative law deference.
So ultimately, one of the checks on Trump is the impeachment power. And given current events, it seems like we should talk about that at least a little bit. There seems to be a general consensus, to the extent that there's a consensus on anything in American political life, that impeachment is absolutely the last remedy, and we should exhaust all other options before anyone even talks about impeachment, and that at least until recently, the polling numbers on impeachment seem to back that up, with a large majority of Americans not supporting the impeachment or an impeachment inquiry of President Trump. Do you think we're too afraid of impeachment? Do you think impeachment should be much more common part of American political life?
It's a really interesting question, and I have kind of mixed feelings about it. I kind of cut my teeth as a young editorial writer writing about the Clinton impeachment, and I actually felt about the Clinton impeachment that it was legally justified and that it was prudentially unjustified, because it's kind of, it's perfectly appropriate to impeach somebody for, what were pretty clear federal crimes that sent a very bad message about respect for the judicial system. On the other hand, I didn't see any great danger to Bill Clinton remaining in office for another year before he was constitutionally required to step down, and I didn't see any urgency about getting him out. There was no danger to the republic, and so I sort of thought, well, impeachment is kind of a last resort, and we're nowhere near where we need a last resort now. So it just kind of, as a matter of prosecutorial discretion, it seemed like a sort of a dumb idea. Yet that was not the position that Congress took. Congress actually took the idea that the moral value of the impeachment as a as a statement of what the House of Representatives believed was acceptable conduct by a president was itself valuable. And I've never really known whether I agreed with that or disagreed with it, honestly. I do think it is very odd to have taken that view of impeachment, which is, hey, it's kind of discretionary here, but we think it'd be a positive message. We're not going to get the guy removed, but oh, what the heck, let's do it anyway. That is the position in 1998, and the position in 2019 under 18 under Republicans and 2019 under Democrats is in the face of very clear, grotesque misconduct that across a number of ranges of issues really does threaten the integrity of the sort of operational investigative powers of the federal government. We're going to pause and kind of wait until there's something that gets the entire caucus angry enough to do it. And the hesitancy throughout the period, I would say between the summer of 2017 and the Zelensky phone call, I think is very hard to square with the role that we do understand impeachment should play, which is, among other things, to send a warning shot across presidents' bow about what they can and can't expect to get away with. So yeah, I think Congress should be, I don't know if they should be as aggressive about impeachment as they were in 1998, but I think they're way too hesitant about it now. And I do think the proper time for an impeachment inquiry to have been launched would have been when it became public that the president had boasted to the Russian foreign minister that he'd fired the FBI director and thereby relieved pressure on himself. I have never heard anybody explain to me why that moment is not a moment that Congress should have snapped to attention.
So here's an interesting impeachment question. Even though removal, from the audience, even though removal is unlikely, let's say the Senate does convict, what happens with Pence? Is he implicated enough in the Ukraine call, which, as you've pointed out, is the line the system has drawn, to be impeached as well? And I think more generally, what are your thoughts on the role of the vice president in all of this? He seems to be very quiet, except for occasionally popping up and repeating administration talking points.
Yeah, I would like to give a piece of advice to the vice president. And it's actually
everyone tweet at him.
It's actually a piece of advice that Susan Hennessy gave him publicly in the summer of 2017. She and I wrote an article about this, and it was sort of reminding him of what Jerry Ford did in the latter months of the Nixon presidency, which was, so the vice president is the one member of the executive branch that the president cannot fire or really retaliate against in any meaningful sense. I suppose he could remove him from the ticket prospectively, but the president can't fire the vice president. And the vice president at this point has a choice, which is how in bed with the president does he want to be? And if I were advising the vice president, who does not seek my advice, unfortunately, I would tell him in all good faith that being too, he's already too closely associated with Donald Trump. He's been too close and too loyal. And there may come a time, I think it's unlikely, but there may come a time when he actually has to be in charge of the government. And he's going to have an identity independent of a by then wholly disgraced president that appointed him. And that actually requires of him a certain degree of disloyalty that is a good reason why he can't be fired. And so I think it is actually important and would be useful for the vice president to not be such a good soldier, but be somebody who has to remember that at any given moment in time, a few conservative Republican senators could show up in the White House and do what Barry Goldwater and a few Republicans did in 1974, which is tell the president, your support base is gone, you're going to be impeached. We're not going to stop you from being removed. And Mike Pence has to be in a position to become president at that point and to swear that oath of office and for it to actually mean something. And I think he is not conducting himself in a fashion that is conducive to maximizing his credibility at that moment. And I think, he's somebody for whom my enthusiasm is altogether under control. But at the moment that he's in that position, he will be in an incredibly difficult position with a real important restorative function to play. And by the way, Jerry Ford played an enormously positive role in the rehabilitation of the presidency after Watergate. And so don't ignore the possibility that Mike Pence might actually have a constructive role to play. And so if I were advising him, I would tell him, put yourself in the position where if you are called upon to play that role, you can do it with maximum effectiveness. And that does not involve being the loyal soldier right now that Trump wants him to be.
So using this just to broaden out for a second, you make the point that the vice president is a separate elected position. He's not fireable by the president. There are other, obviously, positions in the federal government that are not fireable by the president, that are independent. Congress comes to mind, the judiciary comes to mind. And one of the foundational assumptions behind the way this separation of powers was designed by James Madison was that different members of different institutions would guard that institution's prerogatives quite jealously, right? That in some ways the vice president wanting to preserve independent power might check the president, that in particular the Senate and the House wanting to preserve their institutional prerogatives would guard that power quite jealously. And that seems to not have happened. Obviously, the House has now moved to investigate the president, but that seems more explainable by the fact that in 2018 the Democrats took over than by anything else. Now, this to me seems like this has been going on for many decades, the replacement of separation of powers with what's something that's called separation of parties. And I'm curious, do you think that Donald Trump has in any way been responsible for the acceleration of this, or this is just the logical continuation of what's happened for many decades, that now adherence to party has completely replaced any adherence to institution?
It's both. I mean, both are true. On the one hand, we have an environment of radical polarization in which our polarization has mapped onto our party system nearly perfectly. Not perfectly yet. There are still outliers in both parties, but the alignment of party with ideological position is nearly perfect now. And that means that you cannot count on a Democratic Congress to investigate a Democratic president or a Republican Congress to investigate a Republican president. And you therefore can only rely on separation of powers in the sort of classical sense to work to the extent that the party alignment in the distribution of power in those branches maps onto the separation of powers models working. At the same time, like all things, Trump has called the bluff, right? So when Barack Obama is president, and for those of you who detest Barack Obama with all fibers of your being and disagree with the following statement, I'll just say I would say the exact same thing about George W. Bush. When Barack Obama was president, the costs of a Democratic Congress not investigating him energetically in 2009 and 2010 is very modest, right? Because he's not a felon and he's not doing anything sort of radically illegal. And by the way, the same is true of George W. Bush, who has a Republican Congress until 2006, right? And then he has a Democratic Congress, and they the amount of information we learn about the Bush administration as a result of a more energetic posture in the last 2 years from Congress is very small, right? But if you, so the underlying conditions are the same. It's just that the costs of them are very different. On the other hand, and by the way, with Bush, the area where Congress pushed back most hard against Bush, which was on interrogation policy, that was led by a Republican. And so you still have the residue of a kind of less partisan separation of powers model, more institutional model. Trump is very different because he's actually is challenging the prerogatives of Congress all the time. And he was, by the way, when it was controlled by Republicans, all the time. And so the stakes, when you ask how much does Congress care, are dramatically higher. And I think one of the questions that is probably most important, that is completely unanswerable today, but we will learn over the next 10 years, is do subsequent presidents learn from this that you can get away with anything if your party is in power in Congress? Is that the big takeaway, right? That this guy runs a hotel chain, right, where Saudi royal family takes out whole floors, right? Is the lesson that people take away from this, I'm going to run for president, and as long as my party is in power, I can get away with anything? Or is the lesson that people take away from this that there is something serendipitous about this presidency that defied all the rules, but we snapped back to a bunch of the rules, and even a Republican Congress would not tolerate this kind of behavior from anybody other than Donald Trump? I think that's a really open question.
So let me ask a follow-up on that question that's actually from the audience, which is, how has Trump irreversibly altered the future of the presidency, right, for better or for worse? And maybe one way to think about that is, how would a President Pence behave? And does it depend on whether or not he becomes president because Donald Trump is removed or resigns or he wins in 2024? How would President Warren behave? I would imagine that one thing we will have less of no matter who becomes president is admitting on live television you've committed a bunch of crimes. That seems like a bad move generally. But do you think there's any way in which the president has set the new normal for future presidents, even those who might be deeply ideologically opposed to him and his policies?
Yeah, so I think this is an unanswerable question unless you can tell me the precise circumstances in which Donald Trump leaves office. So let me give you two scenarios that are both, I think, reasonably within the realm of immediate plausibility, and they will produce radically different answers to your question, or to the audience member's question. So scenario one is that this current situation fades. The president's base of support remains more or less what it has been, which is to say, in the 538 approval ratings, around 42% with a give or take of 2% in either direction. That proves enough for him after a bruising campaign to get reelected, and he leaves office 5 years from now with an approval rating at 42% and Fox News believing that he's the greatest president ever, and 55% of the population disapproving of his. So this is a totally plausible scenario. In that situation, I think a reasonable Elizabeth Warren, maybe the person he defeats in this scenario, would take away from it, hey, you can get away with anything as long as you keep your base happy. That'll be the takeaway. And the norms that he has violated will be irrevocably changed because they have been ratified electorally. In our system of government, we only really have one way of ratifying or rebuking presidential deviation from expectation, and that is the electoral ratification or non-ratification of. And so in that situation, I think people would reasonably take the view that the people had ratified certain proposed changes to the presidency. And I think, by the way, they would be right to draw that conclusion. Second scenario is Trump does not survive the current balagan, either because he gets impeached and removed, or more likely because he gets impeached and while the Senate votes to not remove him, he is sufficiently damaged by that he is soundly defeated a year and a month from now. I think this is also a completely plausible scenario. Well, I think the public and subsequent presidents would look at that and say, okay, he put a radical proposition on the table about how the presidency should be run, and it really didn't work. He was never popular. He didn't get a lot of policy done. He confirmed a lot of judges, but that was really only because he had control of the Senate, and that was more Mitch McConnell than it was about him. And by the way, he got himself impeached, and he lost re-election in a time of general economic prosperity. That is not a good replicable. If you're a politician of the left and right, and you're saying, I'm looking for models, that is not an attractive one, right? And so then he begins to look a little bit like Andrew Johnson. And it is worth actually pausing over the Andrew Johnson, who was also impeached in his last year of his presidency, who was also impeached, by the way, for non-criminal conduct, including, by the way, and you should all read the 10th article of impeachment against Andrew Johnson, which is basically impeaches him for sounding like Donald Trump. And if you don't believe me, pull up the articles of impeachment and read the 10th article of impeachment against Andrew Johnson. He is not removed. He survives by a single vote in the Senate. And he, of course, is replaced on the Republican ticket by Ulysses S. Grant, who in no sense replicates any aspect of his presidency. And we remember Andrew Johnson's presidency as a kind of radical misfire in the wake of the Lincoln assassination. And it's kind of consigned to, oh yeah, and then Andrew Johnson tried this, and they impeached him and he left office, right? And I think that's a very realistic scenario, a kind of hopeful one, at least from my point of view. But I think unless you can tell me the circumstances in which he leaves office, what the lastingness of any of this is impossible to discern.
So let me follow up with that with a couple of darker questions from the audience.
Darker than that?
Yeah, we haven't even begun. So I think this is a general, I like this. This is more of a general cry for help, I think. Anyone who gives a damn about the Constitution should be frightened. How frightened, in caps? I like that question. But also, two questions here about the possible ways in which Trump might leave or not leave office, which is, one, do you think Trump would ever resign? And I know you're not a political analyst, but I'm curious your thoughts about this. One, do you think Trump would ever resign? And B, and this seems like a nightmare scenario, assume Trump loses in 2020, claims massive voter fraud, and refuses to leave. I mean, what are your views on these kind of end stage implications of a lot of what we've been talking about? Right. I told you, wasn't that darker?
That was darker.
That was darker.
All right, first of all, on the first one, how frightened should you be? The answer is, look, I don't think alarmism is ever useful, but I think this current situation is objectively frightening, and I think it's the American presidency is an office of astonishing power vested in a single person. And when you have significant questions about the morality, the mental health, the conduct, the truthfulness, and the ability meaningfully to swear an oath of fidelity to anything, let alone the Constitution, to faithful execution of the law on the part of the person who holds that power, that is an objectively alarming situation. And I think so I actually, I don't know how useful it is to write down, that and to sort of howl with rage about it, but I don't run away from it either. Would he ever resign? I don't know. I don't do the future. The present and past are hard enough. And I also try to avoid spending time in his head. It's just not a healthy place. I suspect it's not a healthy place for him, but it's certainly not a healthy place for me. And so sort of gaming out his behavior and feelings. My colleague and friend George Conway spent a lot of time doing this and actually just wrote this morning 11,000 words in The Atlantic on the subject of Trump's mental health. It's an excellent piece, and I commend it to you. I will say it is not a way that I find it healthy for me to spend my time. And so figuring out what he's psychologically capable of is just that's a dark place I don't want to spend time. Here's the good news. The last question scenario, I think, is a very manageable one. And here's why. So the president actually doesn't get to choose whether to leave office. And this is where the strength of the institutions in questions matter. So imagine for a minute that your favored candidate, who's not Donald Trump, wins 270 electoral votes, or make it more than that so that there's no question as to the number being adequate. So 300 plus electoral votes. Those elections will be certified by secretaries of state at the state level who do not answer to the president. Okay, so the fact of the appointment of those electors, the legitimacy of the appointment of the electors, is something that the president actually has no influence over. Those electors will be appointed by their state governments, and the Electoral College will meet. And that election of the holding of the Electoral College and the casting of electoral votes is something that the president actually has no ability to influence. None of the people involved report to the president. Steve Bannon warned the president, you can fire the FBI director, but you can't fire the FBI. You can't even fire the director of the Electoral College, right? And by the way, this is one of the few things about the Electoral College that is quite intentionally designed that way, and the design actually holds up pretty well in this situation. Once the Electoral College votes, the person whom it elects president is entitled to take the oath of office, and is, in fact, the Constitution designates the time of that taking of the oath of office. It designates the specific words that person will say. It's the only place in the Constitution that uses quotation marks. It tells the exact words that person will swear. And when that person swears those words, that person is president of the United States. Notice that Donald Trump's name is not in that, right? He doesn't have the ability to refuse to let that person take the oath of office. It's actually not up to him. It may be ultimately up to John Roberts, but when that person takes the oath of office, and this is where we get to a different institution of the United States government, which we haven't talked about, the uniformed military of the United States will report to that person. And I have every confidence that if Donald Trump refuses to vacate the White House, and I don't want to speculate about whether he would do that, because that requires spending time in his head, which I don't like to do, the apparatus of the US federal government will no longer be reporting to him. And so one thing I am completely confident of is that last problem could be politically very ugly, but it actually has a mechanical set of legal answers that will work.
So
that's cheerful.
Yeah. We're coming to the end of our time. So let me ask you two more questions. They're both forward-looking, but I think in a way you'll be okay with. So the first is from the audience here. Based on what we have learned from the Trump presidency, would you advise a future Congress to codify certain previously unwritten norms? If so, which ones? And are there norms that you think should stay unwritten? And if so, which ones?
Beautiful question. All right, so there is some stuff that you can do legislatively pretty easily and that clearly needs to be done. One of them is requirements of disclosure of things like tax returns that have previously always been just kind of normative expectations. Presidents disclose their tax returns because presidents disclose their tax returns. And that has clearly broken down. It needs to be written into law. There are a series of other things like that. For example, Congress has never really tried to figure out what the emoluments clause means. We're litigating that question now. Amazingly, it's kind of an issue of first impression after there aren't that many issues of first impression left in constitutional law, but this is one of them. The fact that it's being litigated on the basis of the emoluments clause is really a creature of the fact that presidents haven't pushed this issue in the past. There are about 10 different ways that Congress could forbid the president from having massive, active private holdings that are being monetized while he's in office, and certainly that should happen. There are other issues that I think are almost impossible to imagine regulating. So I don't know what useful Congress could do to prevent what the president has done to federal law enforcement. The Attorney General reports to the president, is appointed by the president, can be removed by the president. The FBI director can be removed by the president and replaced by the president at any time. It's hard to imagine how that could be changed constitutionally. So if you're thinking about regulating that, you're thinking about a constitutional amendment. Those are really hard. There are also good reasons for those people to be appointable reporting to the president. And so I think there's a baby and bathwater question there. And then there are a bunch of areas in between, areas that I think you could imagine greater regulation being attractive. As somebody who has fallen in love with the Freedom of Information Act over the last few years, I think extending it to the executive office of the president would be a salutary thing. Now, are there potential constitutional issues there? Yeah, there are some. Are they workable? Yeah, I think they're probably workable. So there's a bunch of stuff that would push up against certain constitutional limits, and the Constitution would probably limit what you could do, but you could do some stuff. Of course, to do any of that, you need a functional Congress.
So, no more dark answers. We're on uplifting answers.
No, it's uplift. I'm saying there's a lot you could do. There's a little hill you got to climb up.
So let me use this last question as a way of sending us off, which is, what can we as voters do to adapt to this situation? And what about as lawyers? And I would also add, what about as law students? One question that I'm routinely asked by law students is whether it's still a good job to go into the federal government, given what's going on. And I have to say, I'm personally quite conflicted. I worked in the federal government in the Department of Justice before coming here to Minnesota, and part of the reason I left was that I didn't hugely relish being a national security surveillance policy attorney in this administration. But at the same time, I left a lot of my colleagues back there to deal with this mess, and I'm very grateful that many of my colleagues have stayed there and are doing the best job they can. So, how can we as individuals, and I think really especially as lawyers and law students, react to this?
Yeah. So first of all, the most important thing is just leaving aside as lawyers, but as human beings, as citizens, the most important thing is don't get used to it. You know, you kind of, things feel like they become normal when they go on for a long time. There is nothing normal about this. And the importance of reminding yourself always that this is a deviation, and it is bad, and it is not acceptable, is essential. Is an essential sort of pre-lawyer answer, and that would be the same if I were talking to social workers. Look, lawyers have opportunities to do amazing things in this environment, and yes, some of them are still in government. And one of the other areas that I work on, I've done a lot of work on sort of online sexual extortion, and some of the Justice Department prosecutors who work on these sextortion cases, there's still a lot of sextortion cases to prosecute even in this environment, and their work is largely unaffected by this. And if you have the opportunity to go into government and do good, those are functions that government still needs to play. And there are a lot of kids who are being subject to vile exploitation, and I would never tell somebody don't take the opportunity to go into government service to work on one of the million great things that government attorneys get to do and the good that they get to do. At the same time, there are also an immense number of opportunities outside of government to do good with respect to things that are happening now. And that's everything from representation of people who need representation in asylum claims and who've been separated from their families, to there are some whistleblowers who really need attorneys, and there are, by the way, more whistleblowers, would-be whistleblowers, who've seen things that they would like to be able to talk about than there are attorneys who they know how to reach. And there are also a lot of people, when the government behaves this way over time, there are a lot of people who have righteous claims. Some of them are very public, and some of them are not very public. But there are a lot of people who get injured when government behaves badly, and when the president behaves badly. I will just cite two examples because they're so public that there's no marginal harm I will do by mentioning this. But I mentioned Lisa Page and Pete Strzok the other day, earlier today, and so these are people that served in the FBI at the career staff level, and President tweets about them all the time. Now, without divulging any confidential information, I will just say when the president decides to ruin your life, that has an impact. And if you go through the president's Twitter feed for a week and you notice the frequency with which he names people in an attempt to make their lives more difficult, and you think about that as a lawyer, what are the problems that get created for people when the president decides to ruin your life? And that means there's a lot of good work to do on the outside of government representing people who are impacted. And so I would say all things are on the table. There's good work to do inside of government, there's good work to do outside of government, and there's also good work to do far from government in relation to some of the conditions that are generated by the atmosphere. And so it's a good time to be going into law. I sometimes joke about lawfare people say, wow, this environment has been really good for you guys. And I always respond the same way, which is I said, if you're in the earthquake preparedness business, it doesn't mean that earthquakes are good, but it does mean that they're good for business. And there's something to that for you guys too. This situation generates a lot of work, and you guys should go out and do it.
Please join me in thanking Ben Wittes.